Welcome! Today we're leaving behind the more familiar senses of taste and smell and touch and starting to talk about the vestibular system. One of the really fun and interesting things about the vestibular system is how incredibly overlooked it is. Right? Before you took this class, you certainly knew what taste and smell and touch were, but many people don't have a sense of what the vestibular system is, right? It's not one that we learn about in elementary school. When we're first learning about the senses, we learn about the 5 senses. And as you've already learned, this is a pretty crude characterization, right? This is grouping pain and proprioception and mechanical touch and temperature perception, all under the umbrella of touch. And if people ever do talk about a 6th sense, they're talking about like I see dead people, right? Like a 6th sense is some magical superpower. And it is kind of a superpower, but it's a superpower that we all have. It's our vestibular system. So the next time someone says, yeah, it's like she has a 6th sense for it, you can say, oh, really? You mean she can sense linear and angular acceleration and gravity with it? I really get a kick out of the tagline on this 6th Sense movie poster, right? It says, not every gift is a blessing. But yeah, the vestibular system actually is pretty great. So why is the vestibular system so overlooked? One reason may be that it's relatively inconspicuous. There's a great line in the reading that says, the vestibular system toils in anonymity, right? People don't know about it. So one reason that people may overlook it is that we don't have external organs for it, right? You can see the eyes, you can see the skin, you can see the ears, and the vestibular system is behind the ears, but we associate ears with hearing rather than with our vestibular system. So we don't have any like unique external features associated with it. Another reason that it might be overlooked is that we tend to not notice our vestibular system until something goes wrong. When stimulation to the vestibular system causes us to get dizzy, to get vertigo, to get seasick, that's when we notice it. But short of that, we're very happy to ignore it. It doesn't really give us any joy the way that hearing and vision do, right? We don't use it to appreciate art or eat food that we get pleasure from. So we kind of are only paying attention to it when it makes us feel pukey. One thing that's particularly interesting, though, about the vestibular system, given how inconspicuous it is that unlike your eyes, which you can close, unlike your ears, which you can plug, or your nose, which you can plug, we can never turn off the vestibular system. So it is the sense that is always with you, no matter what else you're doing. If you close your eyes right now, you'll still be very sure that you haven't turned upside down. It's very easy for you to tell that you are not like on a train moving through space right now. You're sitting still. And that is the vestibular system at work. So we're going to start by focusing on vestibular transduction and physiology, and then we'll use that to understand why when you spin in a circle and then stop, it makes you feel like you're spinning in the other direction, why alcohol makes you dizzy, how roadside sobriety tests work, why we get motion sick, and more. So the vestibular system uses mechanical transduction, like the mechanoreceptors in the somatosensory system. However, the nature of the stimulus is very different. Rather than having some kind of external stimulus that leads to physiological changes, in vestibular transduction, there's no external stimulus at all. There's no chemical coming close, there's nothing poking us, there's no temperature changes. So the stimulus of the vestibular system is really very different from any of our other senses. The vestibular system is sensing angular and linear acceleration. So angular acceleration refers to rotations in one of these 3 planes. We're going to talk the most about yaw, which is movement around the z-axis like this. The vestibular system also senses linear acceleration and gravity. So that's like moving forward, moving back, side to side, up and down. Now we distinguish between these 2 forms of acceleration because they're coded for by different organs. It's not just an arbitrary distinction, it's not just a way of carving things up. We actually have different ways of transducing these 2 kinds of stimuli. In this class, we're going to focus on angular acceleration. The way that transduction occurs to code for angular and linear acceleration are relatively similar, and many of the interesting perceptual consequences of vestibular sensation we can understand just through looking at angular acceleration. So why is it important to sense angular acceleration? One of the key roles of the vestibular system is that knowing how we are moving through space can help us maintain our balance and posture. If you say, whoa, I can tell that I'm tipping over, it enables you to correct that and prevent yourself from falling. The action of vestibular transduction takes place inside the bony labyrinths deep inside the inner ear. The bony labyrinths are tiny. They're less than an inch long. You can see through the transparent cheeks of this blue guy where they are situated and just how incredibly tiny they are. So we have a pair of these little bony labyrinths, one on the left side and one on the right side. This part of the bony labyrinth here is the cochlea. We'll talk about that more a bit later on when we're talking about the auditory system. But the action for vestibular transduction is happening on the other end. So the semicircular canals are responsible for sensing angular acceleration, and the otolith organs are responsible for coding for linear acceleration and gravity. Vestibular transduction is the most complex form of transduction that we've talked about so far. So we're going to go through the anatomy and the process of transduction in some detail today. So there are 3 semicircular canals, and they are oriented such that each canal is sensitive to one direction of motion. The semicircular canal that is parallel to the ground, that is sitting in your ear just like this, is sensitive to motion in the yaw direction, like that. So the simultaneous input from the 3 semicircular canals is what renders our perception of angular acceleration. So we have a stimulus, its acceleration, and we know that we're going to create action potentials to get up to the brain because that's what the output of every sensory system is. So the question is, how do we turn shaking our head into action potentials? Here we go. Okay, so the excitement, the action happens in the ampulla, which are small swellings at the base of each of the semicircular canals. We have 3 ampulla in each bony labyrinth that's each associated with one of the semicircular canals. So if we were to be able to look through the bone, you can see the structures within the ampulla where transduction takes place. Now within the ampulla are structures called the cupola. This is a viscous jelly-like mass inside the ampulla. So we've got the semicircular canals, which are like big bony hula hoops full of liquid. The ampulla is a big bony bump at the base of the hula hoop, and the cupola is like a floppy jellyfish that lives in that bump. So let's zoom in more now on the ampulla and see what's going on in there. The semicircular canals, the hula hoops, are full of a fluid called endolymph. And the cupola is attached at the base of the ampulla down here and up here, but is free to flop around and move in the endolymph. Now the key to vestibular transduction is how the endolymph moves relative to the bony semicircular canal. The semicircular canals move just the way your head does. They are bones connected to other bones in your skull. So they are going to move exactly the way that your head does. But the liquid inside it can move somewhat differently. If you imagine holding a cup of coffee and you suddenly push it forward, what happens to the coffee? It sloshes back in the opposite direction, right? The liquid has inertia, it is sitting in place, and so it moves more slowly than the container that it's in. So the semicircular canal has to move the way that the head does, bone on bone, but the endolymph lags behind due to inertia and sloshes in the opposite direction. So that means if the canal rotates to the right, the endolymph sloshes to the left in comparison. Let's watch a video and see how it works. All right, so here's the bony labyrinth. If you were to take the bone away and just see the fluid inside, oh, there's the endolymph. There's the cupola, like a jellyfish moving in the soft waves of the endolymph. Now, if we were to put 3 little balls in the endolymph, I don't know why we'd do that. It's for visualization purposes. What you can see is that as the semicircular canals move to the right, the endolymph is sloshing to the left in comparison. All right, let's do a little demonstration. I want you to put one hand up. It is hard and rigid. This is the semicircular canal. Then another hand is floppy and loose. This is your endolymph. Okay, when the semicircular canal moves one way, the endolymph sloshes the other way. So if you have your cupola down here, if your thumb is your cupola, when this moves in one direction, the endolymph sloshes in the other direction, and it knocks into the cupola from the other side. This is fun when I proctor in-person exams, always during the test. I see people being like, I hope that helps. In the schematic here, when the canal moves to the right, the endolymph sloshes to the left, and that means it makes contact with the cupola. It bonks into that jellyfish on what's shown on the screen here as the left side. So let's zoom in a little bit more in the ampulla and see what's happening in the organs of transduction. So embedded in the cupola are cilia. These are projections from specialized neurons called hair cells. The cilia connect to the body of the hair cells, whose axons make up the vestibular nerve and who carry action potentials up to the brain. So the action of transduction is happening right in here. When the cupola moves, it causes hair cells to move. So as the endolymph sloshes in from this direction, it hits the cupola here and pushes the hair cells to the right. We're going to zoom in one more time and look at the anatomy of the hair cells. So this is the body of the vestibular hair cell. These are the cilia. And the cilia have mechanically gated ion channels at the top, shown here. Now, the endolymph is full of potassium, K+, but it typically can't enter the cell because the ion channels are locked. However, each ion channel has a kind of trap door on it, like a physical barrier that is preventing the ion channel from opening and ions from getting in. Those trap doors are connected to the cilia next to it via structures called tip links. These are like long slinkies that go from the trap door and connect to the adjacent cilia. So in the absence of movement, the cilia are all standing up straight, the tip links are relaxed, and the ion channels are shut. However, when the cupola moves, it displaces the cilia, it presses on the cilia. As you read, there are two types of cilia, the stereocilia and the kinocilia. The kinocilia is the name for the longest hair cell in the bundle. It's the king, that's why it gets named kinocilia. It's the biggest. When the stereocilia bend toward the kinocilia, it causes the tip links to pull open the ion channels, which lets potassium in. As the potassium enters the cell, it brings its positive charge in with it, and the cell depolarizes and leads to action potentials. So why do we call this a form of mechanical transduction? Well, we've got movement of bones that causes movement of fluid that presses against the cupola that jostles the cilia, and the movement of the cilia causes ion channels to be pulled open. So it's fully mechanical, right? You could build this out of like metal and tubes and water, right? It's all mechanical up until the part where action potentials occur. So just as mechanoreceptors in the skin, in our somatosensory system, are literally stretched open, and that's what lets ions in, here we have a case where the cilia are moving, and the movement of the cilia leads those ion channels, again, to be directly pulled open. It's all happening purely mechanically. Mechanical transduction is awesome. All right, so deformation of the stereocilia toward the kinocilia causes depolarization by opening up those ion channels. But what if the other side of the cupola were pressed on? I showed you the semicircular canals moving in one direction that made the endolymph slosh in the other direction, but if we reversed that process, it would cause the endolymph to bonk into the other side of the cupola. So what happens if the endolymph sloshes the other way? That would cause the kinocilia to bend toward the stereocilia, and that's going to have a different effect. You see, the trap doors that are keeping those ion channels shut are not perfect seals. They're somewhat leaky. And so even in the absence of any stimulation, some positively charged potassium can still enter the cell, and that's one of the things that contributes to the baseline firing rate. However, when the kinocilia is pressing toward the stereocilia, the trap doors are sealed more tightly. So here's what consequence that has. We know that when the stereocilia bend toward the kinocilia, we see depolarization, right? So here you're seeing an increased firing rate. But when the kinocilia bend toward the stereocilia, no potassium can leak in, so the cell becomes more negatively charged, more hyperpolarized than it typically would. We see a lower rate of action potentials. So it's dropping even below the baseline firing rate. We talked early on about why having a baseline firing rate is a useful property, and here's a great case in point. If the cell is firing above baseline, it indicates movement in one direction. If it's firing below baseline, it indicates movement in the other direction. All right, so let's see how this works in action. The schematic we're going to be working with is looking at the semicircular canals that code for motion in the yaw direction, so those that are flat in the horizontal plane. So if we're looking down from above, these are the semicircular canals that are visible as seen from above. One on the right side and one on the left side. So let's zoom in more on those semicircular canals now that you're oriented. When I turn my head to the right, both semicircular canals move in the same way. They're both bones connected to bones. The endolymph within those semicircular canals moves in the same way as each other. So when I move my head to the right, the endolymph in both the semicircular canals sloshes to the left. Both semicircular canals are bound to the same laws of physics. Inertia affects both of them the same way. But there's a difference in the consequences that the movement of that endolymph has on how the hair cells in the two different semicircular canals respond. Here's why. The stereocilia and kinocilia are arranged the same way on both sides. So here you see the stereocilia are closer to the nose and the kinocilia are farther back. But when the head moves to the right and the endolymph sloshes to the left, you can see that that means that the endolymph contacts the stereocilia side in the right semicircular canal, but the kinocilia side on the left semicircular canal. Look at that figure for a second and get your head around that. So that leftward sloshing of the endolymph means that the endolymph hits the cupola on the stereocilia side of the right cupola, leading to depolarization, but the kinocilia side of the left cupola, leading to hyperpolarization. We talk about this as being a push-pull relationship. The same head motion is going to lead to depolarization on one side and hyperpolarization on the other side. The depolarization occurs in the ampulla in the direction you are turning toward. So if I turn to the right here, you can see in this schematic, we're going to have depolarization in the right semicircular canal. I kind of think of it as the neurons in each of the semicircular canals being like, hey gang, she's turning our way. It's our turn. Get excited. When you turn to the right, you see excitement in the neurons in the right semicircular canal. We're just talking about this in terms of the yaw direction of motion for simplicity, but the same is true with pitch and roll. When we do a cartwheel, it's causing depolarization on one side and hyperpolarization on the other side. Okay, so here's a nice representation of the same thing. At rest in the top panel, we've got a nice baseline firing rate, and the brain interprets equal firing from both sides to indicate no motion. Now, a turn to the left excites the neurons on the left side and inhibits the neurons on the right side. So you see an increased firing rate in those neurons on the left and a decreased firing rate below baseline in the neurons on the right. Okay, if anything up to this point is shaky, I'd recommend you take a minute to pause and go back and review because we're gonna start building on this now. One of the quirks of the vestibular system is that it has a very rich blood supply near the hair cells, and substances in the blood can easily transfer from the blood directly into the vestibular organs. So when you drink alcohol, as the alcohol is metabolized, it enters different parts of the body at different rates. It enters the cupola relatively quickly because the cupola has a rich blood supply. So it enters the cupola more quickly than it enters the endolymph. So having a higher concentration of alcohol in the cupola than the endolymph means that the cupola is lighter weight than the endolymph is. Alcohol is lighter than water. So it makes the cupola kind of buoyant. It makes it floatier than it usually would. Imagine having a balloon in a jug of water, and instead of the balloon also being filled with water, the balloon has air in it. It moves more easily. It has a different kind of behavior than it would if it had water. So alcohol makes the cupola light and buoyant so that it deflects really easily. As a side note, my favorite euphemism for intoxication is having a buoyant cupola. Okay, so the fact that it is buoyant means that it moves differently. The gentle motion of the waves in the endolymph are now able to push the cupola around much more than they typically would. So what that means is that small motions feel much larger than they are. The way that the hair cells are being deflected by the movement of the endolymph signals a much larger motion than actually happens. So when someone is intoxicated and they make a small motion, it feels like a much larger motion. People will therefore take bigger compensatory actions and overcompensate, which is one of the things that leads people to behave kind of jerkily and clumsily when they're intoxicated. It's one of the things that makes you feel dizzy and more prone to falls. Now, alcohol affects the body in a lot of different ways. It also affects our reaction time, motor control, judgment and decision making, and so forth. So the changes in the vestibular system don't explain everything about those behaviors. They just account for differences in coding for angular acceleration.
So you've talked about the vestibular system as coding acceleration and not velocity. But what I read in this science book here is that velocity is about a change in position over time, but acceleration is about a change in velocity. So that means if I'm going at a constant velocity, there's no acceleration. So what's the semicircular canal doing in that case?
Oh yeah, thanks Violet. That's a great question. Let me ask you something. Do you feel like you're moving right now?
No.
Yeah, I don't either. And yet we both are. We're standing in my house, which is connected to the Earth, which is moving at thousands of miles an hour as it orbits around the sun. But we don't feel it because the motion is happening at a constant rate and everything around us is moving at the same rate. So here's how that works. Let's go back to the scenario of riding in a car and holding a cup of coffee. As the car starts to move forward, the coffee sloshes backwards onto you. But as you keep going for a while, the coffee and the cup and the car are all moving at the same rate. So it's not sloshing unless you go over a bump or something. Similarly, endolymph lags behind due to inertia when you first start to move. When both the bone and the liquid are moving together at a continuous rate after you've been moving for a little while, the liquid catches up and is no longer lagging behind. So let's see how this looks within the ampulla. Okay, so right now we're looking at a cupola in the right ampulla of the semicircular canal that codes for yaw. At rest, all those cilia are perky, standing up straight, firing at baseline. When we suddenly turn to the right, the stereocilia displace toward the kinocilia and we get a big burst of action potentials. But if we keep going, the endolymph catches up with the bony labyrinth. So the endolymph is moving at the same rate as the semicircular canals, and that means, again, those cilia are just standing up straight and firing at baseline. So when everything is moving at the same rate for long enough, the signals that reach the brain indicate that there is no motion. That means if you were to sit in an office chair and spin around at exactly the same rate, so no speeding up and no slowing down, and you didn't get visual input that you were moving and you didn't get somatosensory input of like the wind on your face, the vestibular input would indicate that you're standing still. And in fact, that is exactly what's happening now as we are spinning on the earth and not feeling it moving. Okay, but now the endolymph also has inertia such that when we stop, the endolymph comes crashing into the cupola from the other direction. So now the force hits on the kinocilia side and the cell hyperpolarizes. So back to our example of drinking coffee in the car. After you've been driving for a while, coffee, cup, car, you, all moving at the same rate, so the level of the coffee is flat. But now when you stop suddenly, the coffee sloshes forward, right? When you started, it sloshed backward. When you stop, it sloshes forward. Think of just riding in a car too. When you start to accelerate, you get pushed backward. Then you kind of gradually come back to normal as you're moving at the same rate as the car. And then when you stop, when someone slams on the brakes, you jerk forward and hit the seatbelt, right? And so the ampulla, that endolymph is bound by the same laws of physics. So the motion that occurs when you start to move is the opposite motion that happens when you stop that movement. Let's look at the same thing again using a different schematic that also shows neural firing rate. When there's no motion, the cells are firing at their baseline firing rate. When you first start to rotate, the cells depolarize, which causes an increase in the rate of action potentials. If the rotation continues at a constant velocity, so there is no acceleration, the cupola returns to its non-deflected position, so neuron activity continues at baseline. Then when you suddenly stop, the cells show a large response in the opposite direction. They are now hyperpolarized. Information is then carried by the axons out of the bony labyrinth via a primarily contralateral path up to the thalamus, of course, and then to vestibular cortex, which is located in a region of the brain called the temporal parietal insular junction. You can see it right here. It is so named because it's the place where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe and the insula all come together. All right, so to summarize, we've got 3 pairs of semicircular canals that are sensitive to the 3 directions of angular acceleration. The push-pull arrangement of them means that responses from the pairs of ampulla are opposite. Turn right, you get excitation in the right side and inhibition in the left side. The system codes for constant velocity as no motion at all, and stopping motion leads to the opposite pattern of activation as starting did. All right, I hope you have enjoyed this whirlwind tour of the vestibular system. And if starting this video excited you, I hope stopping it doesn't inhibit you. So pitch is in the same direction as if you're like pitching a ball, right? Moving forward. Roll is like you're doing a cartwheel. And ya is like you're spinning around like a figure skater doing a pirouette. How do you remember that one? Here's how it goes. There's this famous figure skater. Her name is Tanya Harding, and she did a lot of pirouettes like this. I don't actually know if that's true, but there is a figure skater named Tanya Harding. It'll help you remember. Okay. Vertigo is somewhat common. It has a lifetime prevalence of over 2%. And one of the most common forms of vertigo is a condition called BPPV, or benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. And it occurs when minerals from elsewhere in the bony labyrinth, they're actually coming from the otolith organs that code for linear acceleration, make their way into the semicircular canals via the ducts that supply the semicircular canals with endolymph. So now you have this ocean with waves of endolymph, but there's also these boulders in the ocean. So when the endolymph hits the cupola, instead of just gentle wave-like pressing on the cupola, you have like big rocks slamming into it. And so it leads, so small movements feel like much larger ones because of these foreign substances in the endolymph. This can be treated with a physical maneuver that helps get the mineral deposits into a region of the semicircular canals where they're far away from the cupola, or more rarely through surgery. All right, so in this condition, we have rotation to the right. Here, the stereocilia are pressing against the kinocilia, which leads to depolarization. Here, the kinocilia are pressing toward the stereocilia, that leads to hyperpolarization. Therefore, we know that these must be in the right ampulla, because excitement happens, depolarization happens in the ampulla in the direction that you're turning toward. The response in the left side will be the opposite. Hyperpolarization by turning right, depolarization by turning left. All right, I want to emphasize this point because it's something that people often get tripped up on. When you're sitting in an office chair and you spin around to the left, the endolymph sloshes the same way in both semicircular canals. Physics happens everywhere. And the endolymph moves in the same way in both canals because physics happens everywhere. However, the consequence that it has on the ampulla in each of the semicircular canals, that's what differs. So it causes hair cells in the ampulla of the left bony labyrinth to depolarize and those of the right bony labyrinth to hyperpolarize. All right, so you're spinning in your office chair, turning left. When you first start to spin, hair cells in the left ampulla depolarize, left is excited by left, and those in the right side hyperpolarize. When you've been spinning for a long time, you get back to baseline, right? The endolymph is moving at the same rate as the semicircular canals, so the cilia are standing straight upright, so they're signaling no motion. Then when you suddenly stop, you get hyperpolarization on the left side and depolarization on the right side. So why is it that if you've been spinning left for a while and then stop, it feels like you're spinning right? Let's find out. Okay, if we look at the response that we get from those same ampulla, rather than for rotating left, like we've just been talking about, now we're rotating right. When you begin to rotate to the right, you get depolarization on the right side and hyperpolarization on the left side. So what do you notice? Those are exactly the same. When you spin to the left and then stop, you have the perceptual experience of spinning to the right because the neural code coming out of your bony labyrinths are indistinguishable. It's exactly the same for starting to spin to the left and then stopping as it is when you spin to the right. How cool is that? Vestibular illusions are particularly problematic for airline pilots. Typically, when they're determining how the plane is moving, they have access to their own vestibular system, visual input from looking out the plane window, and their instruments. But when visual conditions are poor and they can't see, they have to rely solely on vestibular input and their instruments. So one type of vestibular illusion that can cause a lot of problems for pilots is what's called the graveyard spiral. As an example, if the plane is turning left, initially hair cells in the left ampulla are going to depolarize. So you're turning left and you feel like you're turning left. Now, as they continue to turn left, those hair cells will return to baseline. The endolymph will catch up with the semicircular canals and it will indicate that there is no motion. Then when they come out of the turn, that is, they straighten out and they're going straight, they're going to feel like they're turning to the right. In order to correct for that, they turn more to the left and continue turning to the left and get deeper and deeper into the spin. So if they don't have good visual input, then it means they're getting conflicting input from their vestibular system and their instrument panels. But these vestibular sensations are very strong, and so pilots will sometimes assume that the instruments are malfunctioning. Feel that I'm turning to the right, even though my instruments say that I'm going straight. All right, how does he do it? What a balancing act. So in order to maintain balance, he's going to be using his vestibular system, right? As he moves to one side, he'll be getting signals from the vestibular system about movement that he can use to correct. He's also using his visual system. Visual information is really important for helping us maintain balance. More on that next time. And he's using his proprioceptive system. So as he's getting information from his muscles about which muscles are tightening and which have more slack in them, that's giving an indication of how his body is moving through space as well. That's it for today. Next time, we'll talk more about vestibular illusions, multisensory integration with the vestibular system, and top-down effects. It'll make your head spin.